Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chairman Jock, fellow senators. Appreciate you being here today to work and to hear on SJ 54. Both the U.S. and Wisconsin constitutions broadly protect the freedom of assembly, religion, and speech. However, during the pandemic, we saw places of worship forcibly closed at a time when many needed their faith communities and spiritual advisors the most. Unbelievably, this included parishes like Pilgrim Lutheran Church in West Bend, where a congregation was interrupted by law enforcement in the middle of a pastor's Palm Sunday sermon in April of 2020. In America, in Wisconsin, law enforcement stopped the church service. Even today, our state continues to grapple with the lasting challenges of those shutdowns. Increased mental health problems and depression among children and adults. Many people in our great state seek the solace of their church or their synagogue or their mosque or other religious institution in times of difficulty. It is critical that we protect every individual's ability to gather and worship at those times. This legislation makes crystal clear that these places of worship shall not be forced to be closed by the government during a state of emergency, regardless of that emergency. Protecting every individual's right of conscience and worship from those who might deem it unimportant. And those people exist. As you've heard in earlier testimony, there have been multiple states since 2021 have passed similar reforms. And those states received bipartisan support, and rightly so. This is not a red or a blue issue. It's my hope and prayer that Wisconsin joins those lists this session. Thank you.
Senator Carpenter.
I just have to respond to a couple things, and just as you have personal experiences with your constituents, I have those with my constituents and also family members. What a lot of people did, they respected about what was going on with the public health emergency. And I have an aunt that's 80-some years old that lives in Iowa. And through their church group, what they did is had people check in with each other. There were church services that were broadcast on TV and radio so people could get together. I just want to dissuade anybody who's listening here to think there's this monolithic group of everybody opposed to having some type of what I consider reasonable restrictions or things to take care of a public health emergency. If we were so concerned about the right to worship and closing churches, the legislature shouldn't have adjourned on April 15th, 2020, and went home for the rest of the year, or in 2022, where we adjourned on March 8th, 2022, and didn't do anything. I don't believe any of the rights in the Constitution are absolute. If there were, for example, West Virginia has a law in the books that allows people in religious services to handle poisonous snakes. There are a lot of examples of things that if you want to take to the extreme, I don't know if you want to support those type of practices. But the one thing I'm going to point out, and it's going to be something I repeat every time I'm here as long as I'm in the legislature, but when someone says that we uphold the oath to the Constitution when we swear in, I find it interesting that certain members don't believe in upholding the Constitution when it allows for overthrowing elections. To me, that is more or just as important that individuals who are supporting this legislation said they, made an oath to their public office to follow the Constitution, but when it's convenient, they go ahead and decide that they can overturn the wishes of the majority. But I think there are reasonable ways to maybe not have this in the Constitution. I understand the frustration with having a Democratic governor, but I think there are ways of putting things in the Constitution or having a Ledge Council study committee that can work on these issues. But again, COVID, the pandemic, was something that came around once in 100 years. And there were mistakes made? Yes, there were a lot of mistakes. But I think for this reaction to simply say, geez, people were padlocked out of their churches. Many of the people that I know are very religious folks, and they understood for the greater good that we needed to do this because we had no idea the impact, the spread, the devastation of COVID-19. So a couple statements were made by some of my colleagues, and I just wanted to be able to respond to it. If there's a way of changing some of the language, because not all religious groups, in my opinion, feel that this is the earth-shattering thing, a loss of private right to religious affiliation and practice. So I guess what I would say is to see if you would be interested in somehow narrowing the language. Go ahead.
Senator Carpenter, I have hearing aids and they're buzzing for some reason right now, but moments ago did I hear you say that you felt that nothing in the Constitution is absolute?
That is correct according to the interpretation.
That is the main reason that I would support a bill such as this.
If you want to listen to me, you ask me a question, I'm glad to answer.
If you want to insult me, then we can have that discussion. But
well, you're insulting yourself. But my simple point is the rules of the Supreme Court, they're the ones in our Constitution, and the Supreme Court makes the decision on what rights are absolute and which ones aren't. And to my knowledge, at one time or another, people sitting on the Supreme Court, both Democrats and Republicans, have ruled that none of the constitutional rights are unlimited or cannot be compromised to deal in a certain way.
I guess that sums up why we're on two different sides of the political spectrum.
Yep.
You made a point earlier, Senator, about you know a lot of these, or you have friends that are religious, and how some churches held services outside. This isn't taking that away. A church can still, if there's a pandemic, I would guarantee a majority of churches would do what was necessary for the time being if that was their belief in church leadership. But this prevents just the government from getting involved at all. People may still make decisions that's best for their congregations, but this is absolutely needed.
It forces no one to do anything. It forces the government to stay out of our lives.
Do you believe in a right to a declaration of a state of emergency? To allow it certain, for example, when I was little.
Not when it enters into religion.
Not when it compromises your rights.
Okay, so in 1967, when there were riots in the city of Milwaukee and Chief Breyer closed down the city, you couldn't be out after a certain period of time.
Were the riots based on religion?
You said the exemption was a state of emergency can be a whole a thing of questions.
No, I just said if it's based on religion. No, if I wish to assemble in a church, in a building, to worship the Eucharist of Christ, then that's my right. If a Muslim wishes to assemble in a mosque and worship in the way that they worship, that's their right. This legislation only stops the government from preventing that. If those congregations wish to meet in a field, to meet in a barn, or meet in a warehouse, or whatever, this doesn't stop them from doing that. This does not stop them from doing that. It stops the government from interfering in our lives, simply put.
I see.